here with Sikorsky and Hartford and Stratford. I like Hartford better. Stratford. Yeah. Is it? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. But so yeah, I love going there, man. It's good food, good seafood, lobster and stuff, you know. Hmm.
So what I'll do, Tony, is just do kind of a brief introduction. If I remember, I'll have everybody just briefly introduce themselves. Um, and then right after that, pretty soon after that, I'll go right to you. So
Okay.
the majority of the meeting, unfortunately, is set up for you. So we try to get out of here. Bryce, what time do we need to get everybody out by? About 1:15, somewhere in there?
Okay.
Okay. So, this meeting room, I understand, is pretty popular.
Okay. Well, they'll probably be asking me like 100 questions and stuff,
Yeah, the knowledge that you bring,
Yeah.
I just
So
expect.
there's that.
So, if we run tight on time with the questions, I'll say, okay, let's
All right.
get one more question and then wrap it up here. Let me go meet the shoe vendor here.
Hey, how
So
are you guys?
yeah, I came down here from Connecticut
Did you?
after school.
Where'd you go to school?
New Hampshire.
New Hampshire. Okay. I don't know if you went to was it New Haven?
Oh no,
Isn't that
that's a little too rough for me.
is it? I was surprised around Yale, man. It's a little sketchy around there, dude. We were going
It's
to
not the best place to be.
was it Pepe's?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Frank Peppers.
yeah, I love that. But if you go around there, it's like,
Yeah, you gotta kind of stay in your circle.
yeah, yeah. But I overall, I like Connecticut, man. It's real,
It's nice.
it's real pretty.
It's
You
got
know,
the place.
when you
Can't-
get out,
can't live there, seriously.
yeah, it's too damn expensive. I saw a dude who had a shirt. A lot of people who work with Sikorsky are, they're not like rich or anything. And they said the reason they have homes is because it's families. If they already own, generations or whatever. If they had to buy a home, it'd be out of luck. Yeah. The ECU contingency.
Yeah, still on. Just make sure.
What's up?
Hey, how you doing?
All right, how are you, man? What's up, ECU? How you doing, man? Yeah. Yeah.
Work release.
What's up, man? Floyd? Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Spoken at AHA again, or
Have I?
Dr. Balance?
Oh, I had a Darren Casey, the guy that works with me. He did it because I had something really important. We went to the Eagles concert in Florida, and I couldn't make it. Yeah, no, it was my wife's, so I had to do it. Yeah, yeah, I had to. I didn't have a choice, man. But
You guys are still located in
Greensboro. Yeah. Kind of near the airport, right, right there. Yeah. Oh, do you? Okay. So I actually live in High Point, kind of off the Skeet Club, over that area. So you're in Adams Farm? Okay.
I'm on campus.
Well, yeah, but you were. Uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. What am I here to talk about? I'll yeah.
That's all it's worth.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I said. I told my wife, I said, I have to go talk like smart stuff for about an hour. She said, I find that hard to believe. I only do it when absolutely necessary. Yeah. I have to and then I have to go drink a beer after I'm done. Oh, I used all my brain. Right.
Yeah, I was telling him.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no quarter.
Yeah. Did you see what the state coach said about that? After they whooped us, this last game, he said for 3 years after ECU beat us, like they were about to fire us, and he was close to losing his job. Anyway, so he said for 3 years I had to see ECU people do this little thing they do, and he said I've been wanting to break it off. and that's what we did today. And then so that pissed everybody at ECU off. You know? I think they have to delete that part.
That was the first time. See, I didn't know. I saw it on the website, and I was like,
What is that?
"Come on, what is that?" And he was like, "That's what we do."
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Mhm.
You end up running short for lunch. I'll take out.
Oh no, man, don't worry
How's
about it.
that sound?
That'll be all right. Yeah.
There's some hot dog places down the road.
There's a gas station.
That was my favorite place to go when I was a kid. Hot dogs,
Oh, yeah.
and whatnot.
Oh yeah, look. What? Move this way. Okay.
I
Cool.
love the picture you with the Christmas outfit, the Christmas party. That was cool. Are you gonna wear that again this year?
I don't know, man. We'll have to see.
Classy.
Yeah, I'm taking Meredith because Heather's got to go see Will Swim Sunday.
Yeah. So if everything works out Saturday, I plan on going over.
Okay.
Because I mean, it sounds like he is big time.
This is his. This is where he's honestly this is his championship meet where if he gets recruited a year early, like when he's a junior, it'll be based largely on this meet. And so trying to do some, and he's seen for everything he's swimming, it looks like.
Send me the, as far as I know, to the Greensboro Coliseum.
Yeah, there's a pool there. It's called GAC, Greensboro Aquatic Center. It's where the Coliseum is. Looks like a rough crowd, man. Yeah. I'll let you eat, don't worry. Yeah. Yeah. John said I came to have like a fillet set up for me. Those promises, you know, it goes, get a bag of.
You probably heard what we were saying is Scott is a sponsor that have him speaking.
Okay.
Since he did a case
Yeah. I don't have time for a lot of his crap today, man.
I'm here for a couple minutes.
All right.
What was that? Did you ever see the movie where they're trying to get Mel Gibson into the Games Club? He goes, "I'm just here for the gas." All right, everybody. Grab a seat here. We'll get started. Really great turnout. Yeah.
We're not going to take a test or anything.
No test today. All right. I want to welcome everybody to the meeting of the American Society of Safety Professionals. Everybody's attention. And most of you are aware that the society changed from American Society this summer.
It's embellished slightly, you know. Hey, thank you. All right. Thank you. All right. Don't clap yet. Let's see when I get done. No, I'm glad to be here, everyone. Last time we had this scheduled, there was a hurricane that kind of interrupted the schedule, and then this time it snowed, but you know all about that, right? DOT. So when John asked me about speaking, we kind of threw around a couple of topics, and here's a couple that I get a lot from safety folks, and so I figured these might be good to talk about. And they're hexavalent chromium and silica. The hexavalent chromium standard's been out since 2006, but we still get a lot of calls and questions about it. The silica standard is out / rolling out now. They're different effective dates, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But so the first one is hexavalent chromium, and basically, if we used to mine chromium here, chromite ore actually, in Baltimore, and we produced chromium, and the main use we had in the United States was for military operations. We did hard chrome plating on our artillery shells, and so that meant when they would explode, they'd rip through stuff a little bit better. But the mining operations shut down in 1961, and so now we get all of our ore from Africa, and there's only one place in the United States that actually processes chromite ore into hexavalent chromium, and it's down in Wilmington, and I've actually worked at that plant. And if you've never seen it, I wish I'd have taken a picture of it, but chromite ore is very pretty. You think of ore as like dirt and ugly, but think of it as like little black, shiny, almost pearl-like pellets, and they have it in these big piles that come over, and so that's kind of neat. The other thing is the processing of chromite ore at this plant down in Wilmington. If they have leaks in the piping and stuff, and depending upon which part of the process it is, there's these beautiful crystal structures that form, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but chromium is used in a lot of dyes and pigments. And so one of the things that struck me was when we go around this plant where they process it, and you see leaks, in one area there might be this bright yellow crystal stuff coming down, and then bright orange, and then bright purple. So it's really, really cool and colorful. And so, but it's not so great for you. But basically, if you have hexavalent chromium present in the environment, it's not naturally occurring. We have to go through a process of converting the chromite ore into hexavalent chromium to be able to do things like the plating processes, like for shiny wheels and bumpers and things like that. But there's a whole bunch of chromates that can be made from chromite ore, and there are all kinds of pretty colors, like I said, and this is just a sampling of some of them. They're used in pigments, used in wood preserving. So pressure treated lumber, if you so safety guys like little tidbits to take home with them. So here's one. So you have pressure treated lumber for your deck, and after a year or so you see this white salt coming out of it. Don't lick it, because that's chromium trioxide. So if you get nothing else out of this presentation, you learned that, right? So don't lick the white stuff coming out of the wood there, because that's what it is, chromium trioxide, which is hexavalent. A lot of what we see in the industry, though, is a little point, but is from welding, metal working operations that involve stainless, and depending upon how much exposure you get from the process is is dependent upon the type of welding you're doing. For example, like how many people have seen TIG and MIG welding? Just kind of raise your hand. You've seen that sort of thing. You've seen it, Lindsay? Lindsay's an eye, so of course. But anyway, so TIG welding, think of that, if for those of you who haven't seen it, it's very, I guess you'd say low energy, very precise welding. It's done on usually smaller parts. Where I've seen it done has been on aircraft engine fan blades and small pipes and that sort of thing. So you get less fume coming off from that welding process versus MIG welding, especially if it's when they're using a spool. When the welders say they're going to churn and burn, they're just burning through, laying down a bead. You can get really high exposures from MIG welding. And stick welding, same sort of thing. It's not hard to find exposures over the permissible exposure limit for either of these two. Torch cutting, same story. If we're talking about on stainless steel, I need to clarify that. Typically, you don't see much, if any, for just carbon steel, that sort of thing. And if we have some clients that have to do MIG and stick welding, and they make tank pods for military vehicles to transport water and fuel, and they're stainless steel, and they cannot, there's nothing that can be done to put them under the PEL. And OSHA basically says that, and they have a Q&A document on that, and they said, look, if you're MIG welding down inside of a stainless steel tank, putting in baffles, you're not going to get there. Generally speaking, with welding, it's sort of easy, unless you're doing TIG welding, to have exposures above the PEL. Another factor that kind of plays into that, I should mention, because a lot of places, like let's say here, if you have maintenance folks, if they only do a little bit of stainless welding, like 10, 20 minutes every month or two, and let's say it's MIG even, you might not have overexposures. But so the duration is a factor too, the duration of these welding. Textile dyes, there's all kinds of chromates that are used in that. All sorts of pretty bright colors like you see there. Leather tanning. One that I've worked with in Connecticut, I was saying, this is actually from a Sikorsky picture, but this is a nose cone for a military aircraft. The military loves to use chromate primers because it works, and it's been so hard for them to get away from that. Because if you think about it, if you're flying in a helicopter, if you have something rust through and it fails, it's kind of bad news. There's no parachute for a helicopter. But same way with aircraft. I actually had to do work with the Air Force. They tried making their new F-22s without hexavalent chromium primer, and they were rusting. So they had to go back and take it all off and put the hex chrome stuff on it. But it's this green. Actually, the primer is kind of that light green color there. So you also have hexavalent chromium exposures from plating operations like this. This would be one where I'd expect to see a lot, because see all the bubbles, it's just frothing there. The more of these bubbles that pop, the more mist that gets into the air, the more exposure. Where we really see high exposures from plating is when folks replenish the acid. They dump hexavalent chromium trioxide, typically flakes, into the bath to replenish the strength. and that dust will I've had folks tell me they'd have nosebleeds immediately upon doing that. So hexavalent chromium, basically, it can cause lung cancer, nasal septum ulcerations and perforations, asthma, allergic and irritant contact dermatitis, and conjunctivitis. But other than that, it's pretty safe, I'd say. You know, but the lung cancer issue sort of came up through the folks. There's a several epidemiologists, the Baltimore prostate hexavalent chromium, and that's where we found roughly a doubling of the risk for lung cancer, 2 times the reference population. Okay, so this is the part that's on the test that you guys have to remember. ACGIH is the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists. They have threshold limit values, which are exposure limits for the different chromate species. And what you'll see, if we just start off at the bottom, the water-soluble ones have a higher number, meaning you can be exposed to more of that. And as you go up to the insoluble is 10 here. And then at the very top, it goes down to a 0.5. And so essentially the thinking behind the development of these limits is water-soluble forms will react in the upper airways, and they'll cause ulcers, and they'll eat through the nasal septum. That's platers. They have this term, they call it plater's whistle, because when they breathe, the air is kind of swirling around through the hole in their nose. So the good news is the water-soluble stuff just kind of eats a hole through your nose, and it's and irritation and all that kind of stuff. But the more serious health effects, like lung cancer, are from the insoluble forms that can get down into the lung and be deposited there, and then over some period of time release ions that can cause damage to cells in the lungs that can result in cancer. And the lowest exposure limit is for this one is strontium chromate, which just to complicate the matter is considered slightly soluble. So it's kind of the worst of both worlds. It can pass through without reacting, pass through the nasal passage and the upper airways, and then it can get down into the lung, and it will dissolve faster to cause damage, and so that's why it has the lowest exposure limit. So OSHA has so I'm going to back up. So these are the limits for from ACGIH. Then OSHA has one for all forms, and it's a 5 microgram with an action level of 2.5 micrograms per cubic meter of air. And OSHA says when they developed their standard, there's roughly 380,000 workers in the United States that are exposed to hexavalent chromium. And so, as is usual for shipyards and construction, there's a different standard than for general industry. But basically, what OSHA says is you have to keep exposures in these settings below the PEL. There's no action level in OSHA in the construction and shipyard, and regulated areas are not required. But in general industry, there's this requirement for initial monitoring, unless you already have objective data that shows that you don't have exposures that exceed the action level or PEL. And then if you do monitoring and you find out that you are either over the action level or PEL, then there's periodic remonitoring requirements. And depending upon how high the exposures are, if it's the action level, you have to do monitoring every 6 months. If the exposures are above the permissible exposure limit, it's every 3 months. And then they say you have to notify the workers that were monitored within 15 days of receiving the results. And you've probably seen this before, like in other standards, if you have duplicate sampling events at least 7 days apart that show that you're below the action level, you can stop monitoring. If you were above the PEL and you drop it down to below the action level, then you can reduce the frequency at which you sample as well. For general industry, you have to establish regulated areas, which are usually roped off or taped, or painted lines on the floors. that sort of thing, if you have exposures above the PEL. If you have exposures above the PEL for more than 30 days a year, then control measures have to be implemented. And then this requirement got a little bit of pushback when it came out. They said if there's potential for skin exposures, then you have to do protective clothing and equipment. And it doesn't matter how much hexavalent chromium is in the material. There's no guidance on that really. And so it was sort of put people like welders in a bad spot because they said, well, we don't have skin irritation from this because it's not the type of chromate that causes the irritation. So, but it seems like largely that's kind of not been a problem. Just like this next one, I thought was going to, possibly an issue, and that's with the housekeeping. OSHA inspectors, if they come into an area where people are eating and they see something on the table and they say, well, these guys are welders, that looks like it could be welding fume, I'm going to take a sample. And basically the way it is if there's any hexavalent chromium on that sample, then the OSHA person can issue a citation. But OSHA people are reasonable, aren't they? No, and I haven't really seen that be a problem. I think they have exercised, as much as I can tell, have been pretty reasonable in dealing with that. And I've had clients that got cited for it, and I said, yeah, you deserved it, because they weren't doing a good job cleaning up their eating areas. So then medical surveillance is the thing if they have exposures above the PEL for more than 30 days a year, or if employees have signs or symptoms that, indicates that they may need medical evaluation, or if some sort of emergency, like a spill or massive exposures or something like that. Okay, so that's hexavalent chromium, and we've got a full 30 minutes to talk about silica. Are there any questions on hexavalent chromium before I move on? Or did that answer just every question? No. What you got?
Build is not thick or deck.
You're right. Deck.
I have dogs.
Yeah.
My dogs go out on the deck. They lick their feet all the time.
I haven't. Have you ever heard of that, Lindsay? I haven't heard. I haven't heard of that being a problem. I've seen them recommend that you not, it's more for like kids. With kids they like to eat lead because it tastes sweet. And so more of a kid, putting their mouth on the wood and say, hey, that looks like sugar, or something like that. But
So I can tell my wife there's not a problem, so I don't have to replace the deck.
just don't tell her. Don't tell her. You just forget you heard it, or because she'll have you go get that what's that synthetic stuff, Trex. That's way more expensive, isn't it? But, okay. So all right. Any other questions? All right. Has anybody ever had to do any sampling for hexavalent chromium or any of that? Or yeah. Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So silica. Silica is basically everywhere. And pretty much anything you can do, you can have silica exposure. I'm kind of overstating that, but not much. There's so many places you can have silica exposure, and that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons that OSHA kind of got on doing this. And shout out to the North Carolina Dusty Trades, because they're not here anymore, right? They're not around anymore, are they? Dusty Trades. But a lot of the sampling data that was used for the TLV development, and I think even some of the OSHA stuff, was from the North Carolina Dusty Trades program. So some of the folks, Romy and those guys, But anyway, so you can have silica exposures in construction, and I've got a lot of pictures and show you examples. And I've monitored for this in multiple construction sites, glass making, pottery. I haven't done pottery, but concrete making. We do a lot of that. Foundries, dental laboratories. Let's see, jewelry even. Jewelry production. cut stone, that's actually a big one. Refractory, like furnace work, railroad track maintenance. Now, I was like, how's that? Well, and I teach an industrial hygiene course for ASSP. I'm so not used to saying that yet. But and we had a lady who was railroad, and I said, where is that? And they said they have these when they're doing work, I guess, kind of smoothing out the tracks. They have these rail cars full of sand, and they use sand somehow in the process. But that's where that comes from. Fracturing. Has anybody seen a fracking operation? Or so fracking, they have dump trucks, dump truck after dump truck of sand coming in, and they pump it down in this well with like soapy water and stuff to crack open the shell. Yep.
They do that a lot in West Virginia.
Yeah.
It's about 50.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so there's tremendous opportunity for silica there. And you see a cloud of this stuff when they're doing, I mean, you're dumping truckload after truckload of sand. Abrasive blasting in any kind of setting. Actually, I was in Canada to do an air monitoring, and it was in an office building, and we had high levels of silica in the air from in an office. And you might wonder, like, how did that happen? Well, the floor above, they had concrete walls, and they were resurfacing the walls, and they were blasting it. But they were using walnut shell, but the wall was concrete. And so it was generating dust, and it was somehow actually what it was, they didn't have the air ducts sealed off like they thought they had. And this dust was coming down to the floor below. But they couldn't understand that, well, we're using this walnut shell or whatever, how are we getting silica? Well, it's the substrate. It's not because you always think the material you're blasting with is where the silica comes from. But in this case, it was the material being blasted. So silica, crystalline silica, also known as silicon dioxide. Mostly what we deal with is quartz here in America. ACGIH used to have TLVs for all three forms. I think they dropped the one for tridymite. I just don't think we see it very often. Yeah, and so like I said, silica is pretty much everywhere. It's so easy to have exposure. I think this is actually a really good standard to have. We needed it for a long time. Because what can happen is silicosis is an incurable disease. It can put you at an increased risk for lung cancer, COPD, kidney disease, even tuberculosis. And so what happens is if you look at silica under a microscope, it looks really gnarly. It's like these little jagged shards of glass, basically. And so what happens is it gets down into your lung, your pulmonary macrophages try to swallow it, it punctures them, and then all those digestive enzymes spill out into the lung and scar the lung tissue. And so at whatever point you get enough scarring and damaged lung tissue, then you notice you can't breathe quite as good as you used to. And then at that point, it's sort of too late. The International Agency on Research of Cancer says it's a confirmed human carcinogen. ACGIH says it's a suspected human carcinogen. So there are different levels of silicosis. One, the chronic can take 10 years of exposure at low concentrations. Accelerated can be 5 to 10 years. And then there's acute that can happen very quickly, weeks even. And so you guys have probably heard about the Hawks Nest Tunnel, the Gauley Bridge disaster, where somewhere around 500 workers died from acute silicosis when they were boring through this tunnel, this mountain in West Virginia to build a railroad. And it was in the early 1930s, which was the Great Depression. People needed work, and so they put up with it. And, there's just horrible stories about just, bodies stacked up, from the workers dying and that sort of thing. And so, yeah. Mm-hmm. might even be higher. Yeah, yeah. So it was a really bad situation, and it turns out like there's really no concern for worker health or any of that. It's just they just put them in there and had tremendous exposures. And so at that point we kind of figured out, hey, the silica thing's a bad deal. And in fact, so that was in the 1930s when asbestos started to becoming more in use. There was concern about asbestos because it was a silicate, and they said, well, hey, it's in that family, could this potentially be a bad thing? It turns out it was. So, like I said, initially you may not have any symptoms. Then it develops into difficulty breathing, coughing, stuff, and you're more prone to infections, weight loss, and active TB. So, mining, any kind of handling of, earthen materials, and result in silica exposures. If they have big rocks and they try to make them into little rocks from, hammering, crushing, all that kind of stuff, then silica. Abrasive blasting. This looks like he's blasting steel, but they used to use sand quite a bit. You can really get high exposures. One of the things I remember, there was one of the guys with the Dusty Trades program was told this story I thought was kind of interesting. They had two guys, I think they were DOT, DOT workers. Anyway, they were doing sampling and they were wearing hood respirators, airline respirators, and one guy had no exposure, no measurable exposure below the detection limit, and then one guy had just tremendous exposure, way over the PEL and everything. And so they were asking, well, what's the difference? Well, the one who had low exposure was experienced. The one who had the really high exposure was not. He had been like sweeping the day before, and they said, hey, you need to get on this thing and blast a bridge. And he did not know that you were supposed to plug in the respirator. And he wasn't real sure about his work, so they said the other thing that happened was in the midst of the dust cloud, he'd take it off and look, and you've got this cloud of silica around you. So training is always good. I always try to remind people of that. Anytime you have concrete, masonry products, drilling and cutting, like cutting here and boring a hole through, this is a big tank they're kind of putting an access door. About a year or so ago, a study, it was published in one of the safety magazines. And anyway, what they found, it sounds pretty obvious, but don't ever assume that people think of these things. But they said, hey, if you're cutting through concrete and drilling and stuff like that, if you use sharp tools, it actually cuts through faster, so it decreases the amount of dust you generate, and it also decreases how long you're standing there cutting through it. Now that's kind of brilliant, but very simple, isn't it? I mean, and so they said, one thing that can be done to limit exposures is just have a program to make sure your tools are, if you're doing this cutting and stuff, make sure your tools are sharp. And it can be that simple. So there's a firm in Greensboro that blows up buildings like this, and you can get a lot of dust from that. I always think about that when I see them do that on TV. I've not had the opportunity to be near it, but that's certainly one, because buildings are made with a lot of concrete products. I got a quiz for you guys. Now, Lindsay, you don't say it. Is there any other industrial hygienists? Don't tell them the answer here. But so manufacturing of glass, obviously sand goes into the process, but we found really high exposures among people who make bricks, abrasive, sandpaper, and shingles. But I want to ask you about bricks and shingles. What is it, do you think, that could give people really high exposures to silica from bricks and shingles? And I'm talking about when they come out of their work area, they're just completely covered in dust. Any ideas? What is it?
I worked in a plant that made the granules, coated the granules to put on shingles.
Okay.
And we also crushed the stones, so there was a lot of silica in the stones.
Yeah.
The dust from the granules that go on the shingle.
Yes. And so quartz exactly from the shingles. That's right. And then from the bricks, what we found is there's some brick makers in this area, and there are people, like if you want the pretty bricks with the little design on them, there are folks who actually grab a handful of quartz and they sprinkle it onto the visible side of the brick to give it that design, like the white, you know. And so folks who do that, they're just scooping pure quartz and, you know, and maybe some other things to get of other colors, but, you know, it might be white, black, brown, whatever color they want. But, you know, so they do that for the decorative part of it. Furnace maintenance, I've talked about textured paints, like the faux finishes with all the sand in it, you know, when they mix those. Filter maintenance. If you have a dusty process that generates silica exposure, and people always think about, well, the workers who are doing, let's say, the shingle, you know, they're standing there. Say you have an exhaust system and it's sucking all the dust away. Well, you might not think about the mechanics who have to change out the filters in the bag house, and they have really high potentials for exposures from there. A lot of times at mining operations, we can have people who have overexposures just from driving, you know, because the roads are dusty. So there's a guy who rides around in a little water truck and just keeps the roads damp to keep the dust down. Has anybody ever seen this concrete finishing? Oh man, it's so dusty. And basically what they use here is like a little diamond wheel. And so what it is where they poured the concrete and it's kind of rough looking. They smooth it out to make it look nice. And so these folks can just have just huge exposures, and from that finishing it. So you can see there's the rough. Maybe you can. I don't know if you can see all it. And then it's smooth around there. But that can really. So you're just grinding away concrete there that has a lot of sand in it. But you find concrete anywhere like highway construction. How many times you've seen people? Don't listen to this, but cutting through concrete, just dust, just blowing around like crazy. North Carolina doesn't do that, obviously, but I've been to other states though. So there's, let's say that guy's cutting, and then there's that brush, that big, that'll stir it up too. But okay, so foundries and a lot of operations, we monitor that a good bit. They use a lot of sand in the foundry process. Now, there's, again, for silica, there's TLVs and there's PELs. For ACGIH, the TLV is 25 micrograms per cubic meter, measured as a respirable fraction, so you have to use a little cyclone. It's slightly different than monitoring, say, for hexavalent chromium, a different sampling apparatus. And so I'm going to back up. So ACGIH is 25, OSHA is, the PEL is 50, but they have an action level of 25. So they're pretty close. When they were coming out with it, I thought it was going to be 25 for OSHA, but there's other considerations. One thing, I'll just make a note of this for you. ACGIH, their standards or their TLVs are health-based only. So, and then for OSHA, got to consider all the other stuff that's not health, like economic feasibility, that sort of thing, impact on small businesses. So what causes that sort of problem? But the the construction standard became effective last year. And has anybody had to deal with this yet? The Silica standard in construction? Okay. And so what they say is you can do your own sampling and figure it out. You're below the limits they've set, or you can use Table 1 as your guide. Now, just for clarification here, OSHA says construction means work for construction, alteration, and or repair, including painting and decorating. So just because you're in here, like in a general industry setting, you can be doing construction work, so just be aware of that. Here's an example of table 1. Table 1's a lot bigger, but this is only one I could fit on this slide. But basically what it is it said, okay, if you're in construction and you're using handheld power saws of any blade diameter, and whether it's indoors or outdoors, how long you're doing this sort of work, they say, what type of respirator you should wear. They say assign protection factor of 10, whether it's less than 4 hours or more than 4 hours. Let me back up. If it's less than 4 hours and you're outdoors, you don't have a respirator. If you're indoors, you do. An APF of 10 is like a half mass respirator. What I like though, so that table 1, OSHA put it out, and they got a lot of questions. I mean, it's not a lot of information. It's just sort of cut and dry. But OSHA did an excellent job with these fact sheets. Has anybody seen these fact sheets? Aren't they wonderful? They're so nice. And I don't know of any other standard where they have anything like this. Now, what I'm showing you here is there's one for handheld power saws and there's one for crushing machines. They have them for all the activities in table 1. And they're about 2-3 pages or more. And they're very, very detailed. And in fact, it's some of the best industrial hygiene advice you can get. Concise and very, very helpful. And this is an excellent idea, and I hope they do more of this sort of thing. But basically, they're talking about, let's say we're in a crushing machine. It gets down to details like, okay, you need a operator. The operator needs to be isolated. They need to have a filter for the cabin. They talk about the MERV rating of the filter for the cabin. Really good stuff. The seals on the doors and all that. I mean, just good info. And so I think if you have to do anything in construction and you want to refer to Table 1, absolutely go and look at the fact sheets that apply to all the Table 1 activities. Yes, sir.
On other occasions when the government gives us good advice,
Mhm.
citing or making recommendations for things in here that aren't in the standard.
Have you seen them cite based on the fact sheets, based on what's said in the fact sheets? Now, the Table 1 is the standard, and so they can cite from that. I would say this is more like supplemental information, just to. Yeah. Dude, I haven't seen it yet, and just kind of to fill you in on what we've seen in consulting. So usually what happens is if OSHA cites a company, they come to us and say, help me, OSHA. They're all over. So we see it all the time with hexavalent chromium. I mean, they're enforcing that like you wouldn't believe. I've only had one citation for a contractor for Silica so far, and he was just wrong. He was just way wrong, and so he deserved it. So have you guys seen it at EI or any other consultants? Have you seen a lot of citations? Uh-huh. Yeah.
But was it something in the standard or something beyond it in the
Yeah. Just to give you an idea, usually when they're wrong on this, they're very wrong, and so they're not really getting into that. But I haven't seen that yet, and this is supposed to be supplemental information that's very good. I don't know. They might not. Okay, so if regardless of whether the employer for construction does their own monitoring or if they use Table 1, they still have to have a written exposure control program that addresses tasks that involve high exposures, and by high I mean exposures above the action level, and control methods like restricting access to those areas and that sort of thing. Now, they need to designate a competent person who has the authority and the knowledge to implement the control plan. That's sometimes overlooked. Restrict housekeeping practices to, if they're feasible alternatives, like not blowing, that sort of thing, using wet methods. And then offer medical exams every 3 years for people who have more than 30 days per year exposure over the PEL. Train workers in wet exposures, and then keep records of the monitoring data and the medical exams and that sort of thing. They say objective data, but that's if you've come up with your own estimate for exposure. I've never seen anybody do that. I don't know. Yep. Some of the what now? Yeah. 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 How they can function. Yep. Now, so we were talking about construction before. Now we're talking about the General Industry Standard 1910-1053. It does not apply to construction, agriculture's processing of sorptive clays, where they have exposures below the action level. Or here's kind of a little twist. If it's general industry and there's, if the employer is complying with Table 1 and the task that they're doing is not indistinguishable from what they've listed in Table 1, then they can just comply with that because that's good, right? I mean, it's got all the control measures you need to control the exposures, and that's what OSHA really cares about at the end of the day. Okay, but it can't be something that's done just routinely, in general industry. You say, well, we're complying with Table 1, but, well, you do it every day and that sort of thing. It can't be like that. Okay, so for the general industry standard, you have to have an exposure assessment. Usually that's air monitoring, periodic monitoring based on how high the exposures are, 15-day notification, regulated areas over the PEL, written control plan, respiratory protection, housekeeping measures, medical surveillance, hazard communication, and employee training and information. It's a lot of the same things in the construction standard, but it's a little more robust for general industry. And that's because it's not fluctuating. The work environment doesn't change dramatically from. So, maritime effective June 23rd, above the action level, that becomes effective in 2020. And if they're over the if they're over the action level, you have until 2020 to do medical exams. If they're over the PEL, you had to do it beginning in June. Fracking, they have till 2021 to comply. And maritime is in effect. So, types of engineering controls people can use. We're going to be down to the minute, John. I got it. I'm going to get you out here at 1. But the same hierarchy of controls. Substitute, isolation, ventilation, dust suppression techniques. How many people have had to deal with abrasive blasting? Ever seen? Okay. So we used to always recommend, hey, use something other than sand like Black Beauty. Well, I told you I do these industrial hygiene courses for ASSP, and we had a contractor in there who did a lot of abrasive blasting, and he said that they actually, Black Beauty, I always recommended that. They said actually they're now over the PEL because the PEL is so low when they use Black Beauty, because it has less than 0.1% crystalline silica in it. It's a slag product from coal fire boiler slag. And I looked at the MSDS, and sure enough, it does. It's got a tiny little bit, but that tiny little bit could be enough. And so what they have gone to now, and what I've told folks, is there's this green diamond sand products that has no free silica, and they said that's what contractors are moving toward, because even the Black Beauty, even though it's a tiny amount of silica, it can be enough to put you over the PEL based on how much you're doing, the TLV. In these types of situations where you're moving dirt and sort of thing. Rocks, enclosures to keep the operator, protected from the dust with good seals. All the kind of stuff that was on that fact sheet we talked about. And HEPA, not HEPA, but MERV 16. That's HEPA almost. Is 16 HEPA? It's right up there. But using wet methods. Here you see there's a water hose that's going to this saw, and if you look real closely, you can see water squirting out there. Mopping instead of dry sweeping, not using compressed air. Simple little things like just washing yourself, washing your hands before you eat, that sort of thing. Not blowing off with compressed air. I mean, everywhere I go, I see people still do that just because it's expedient. So that's all I have to say about that. We got like 1 minute if there's any questions. Sorry, I was a little rushed there, but you got one? I haven't seen that. They're both, but they're both risk factors for lung cancer alone. So there's that. But I haven't seen anything where there's that synergistic like 6 times versus. I haven't seen that. Yes, sir. I've seen that with respirator use, but that can happen certainly. But in terms of like silicosis and that sort of thing, I don't know. I haven't seen anything on that. I would assume that they kind of be about the same thing. If they're having those types of effects, they probably can't wear a respirator. But I don't know specifically if they say, well, we've got beginning stages of silicosis, they can't do this work anymore. Probably shouldn't, one more little thing I'll tell you. One of the first jobs I did as an industrial hygienist, I went to this place where they told me to do just nuisance dust monitoring. And I went in there, and there's these bags had skulls and crossbones on them, big red letters. This is danger, lung hazard. It's like, wow, this doesn't look like nuisance dust. It was kind of scary. So I looked, and it said microfine silica. It's like, so I called my old boss, and I said, hey, this looks different, man. It says silica here. And so I told the employer, like, we've got to change. This isn't just nuisance dust. This is real stuff here. We got to change what we're doing. And so the guy got really mad at me, and he tried to get me fired, my first job, And he said I was just stirring up trouble, And it turns out that what you said made me think of this. They came in and did some x-rays, and there were 10 employees, and like 4 of them had the beginning stages of like the early signs of silicosis with the scarring and everything. And then at that point he said thank you, for helping them. But this is also a guy whose ventilation system that he designed himself fell from the ceiling a couple of times because it got loaded up with sand because it didn't have enough to transport velocity, and so it just filled up and fell. But he was very proud of it, and it was hard to criticize it. But so there are real exposures out there that people have to silica, and you sometimes can stumble upon them. Like I talked about, and this place, they made buffing compound for NASCAR. That was their main client. They polished the cars and had really fine microfine silica in there, and it was this paste that they used. But you can kind of find it almost anywhere. So, all right. Any other questions? Yep. Well, I have it if it's possible, because I grew up at the beach. It's possible. There's people who make sand are kind of concerned about it, like play box sand, sandbox stuff for little kids. Their lawyers are concerned about it, right now. So, I don't know, it's quartz is. I hope not, because I have silicosis.
Any other questions? Well, I have one for you, Tony. Could you tell us, Tony, let's talk about the beach. When you were in high school, could you tell everybody about the falsified absence list?
Yes. So I grew up in Wilmington, and my brother and I skipped school one day to go surfing because there was a surf competition on Saturday. We skipped school on Friday. And they were replenishing the beach. They had these big pipes, they pump sand in from out in the ocean back up onto the beach. And so this newspaper reporter snapped our picture. It was a really cool picture. We were jumping over the pipe like this with our surfboards in the air. It looked really cool. And so he was like, "What are you guys doing?" So we said, "Hey, we're getting ready for the surf contest tomorrow," blah, blah. Gave them our names. And so didn't think any more of it. And it was only Sunday. And high school knucklehead, I didn't read the newspaper. Anyway, so I had falsified my sick note on Monday, and my homeroom teacher, who was a baseball coach, I gave him my note. He said, "So you were sick, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, what was wrong with you specifically?" And I said, "Well, I had like a little cold." And he said, "Did you have a fever?" I was like, "Yeah, maybe a little bit, And he asked a few detailed questions. He said, you feel better now?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." And so he took the front page of the paper and he just slapped it on his desk, and he called me a dumb. But he approved it, so I was good to go,
You had silicosis from jumping
Yeah, I could have done that. But as long as he approved it, it was fine. And he was just like, "You're so dumb," and he's like, "Boom, here it is," And I said, "Okay, well." But luckily he was cool about it. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Sweet.
For you to take one of the tickets here and then call out the last three numbers of the tickets.
All right, I'm not going to look. What do they win?
Somebody gets a free lunch at another meeting.
All right. It is 415. Boom. Hey, and it has nothing to do with him being from ECU.
I want to thank everyone for attending. The holidays approaching, so happy holiday. Be very careful with the holidays. We never know what type of conditions we may have. Hopefully, also want to mention
Oh, heck yeah, dude. Sweet. Those look. Probably